this introductory session about Pire Create project. I'm Natalia Ruiz Menal, Communication and Program Manager of the project, and I want to thank you for attending to this session. Pire is an acronym that stands for Partnership in International Research and Education, and it is a program sponsored by the National Science Foundation. We are a group of 34 scientists from different universities and institutions from the United States, such as University at Albany, State University of New York, and Columbia University, from Brazil, University of Sao Paulo, and Yanigla in Argentina. The main focus of our project is to reconstruct how and why climate has varied in the last 1,000 years over the Americas. Many of these climatic variations are associated with major social impacts, so our last goal is to transform the scientific data into actionable information by creating visualization models and climate information tools relevant to policymakers, the scientific community, government, and civil society. We also have an educational and outreach pillar that involves undergrad and graduate students into national and international activities. Every year we organize the Pire Academy. This is a 3-day course for undergraduate students across SUNY. They have the opportunity to do field and lab work in dendrochronology and participate in workshops about climate change and how to inform policy and decision-making about it. Also, the summer school, this is a week program where undergraduate and PhD students from different countries across the Americas can be part of a real field trip. After that, we show them how to analyze the samples at the lab, and of course, they get short lectures given by our experts. Last year, we held it in Brazil, and this year was planned to do it in Peru, but given the situation, we have to cancel until next year. And finally, we offer exclusively to UAlbany students to go abroad and do research in a dendrochronology lab in Argentina, or to study abroad during a whole semester in the University of Sao Paulo, being all the expenses covered by the Pire Create project. So if you want to learn more about science, paleoclimatology, climate change, or other related topics, you have a lot of information in our website. Also, there are some resources available at our social media channels, like YouTube and Instagram, and you can look for webinars about climate change or videos about our summer school, Pire Academies, all these activities that I just mentioned. So this is just a short introduction about our project, and Ernesto is going to talk about the main research topic of our project, which is paleoclimatology.
Thank you, Natalia. My name is Ernesto Tejedor. I'm a postdoc here at the Department of Atmospheric and Environmental Sciences at UAlbany. I work in the group of Professor Matthias Bill. I wanted to talk to you about a little bit the context of why we study paleoclimatology and what some of the things that we do here in the group and within the Pire Create context. I wanted to start with this map of the annual surface temperature since 1880. As you can see in the map, there are large areas of the Earth which are in gray. That means that we have no data there. If we move towards the present, we can see how these climate temperature anomalies has changed from since 1880 towards the present. In blue, meaning negative anomalies, so colder temperature, and in the same is the opposite is true for positive anomalies. And as you can see, in the last period, we obviously are having warmer temperatures. So we live now in a warmer temperature than planet than 130 years ago, and that is a fact. We know that because we have this weather instrumental stations. So if we look at the global mean temperature with instrumental data, this tells us that there is an increasing warming trend. But why is that? Why is that happening? And is that because of the natural forcing? Is that because of the anthropogenic activities? So to learn more about that, we need to put that current warming into a longer term context. Just to give you an idea of how is the situation of the instrumental weather stations around the globe, we have a pretty good distribution of instrumental data for the last 70 years, more or less. But then towards the past, this information becomes really scarce. And certainly for some areas in the globe, there is no data at all. And when we go back before the Industrial Revolution begins, there is no instrumental data. So how do we learn how was the climate prior to that huge impact in the climate system that was the Industrial Revolution? So we need to go to proxy records, and we need to do paleoclimatology. One possible definition of paleoclimatology is that it's the study of the Earth's past climate history, and by studying climate variability of the past, it is possible to learn about patterns and trends of the Earth's climate system. So by inferring these past climate conditions using paleo records, what we call proxies, we can improve our estimates of the range of natural variability in the climate system and understand how this variability has changed over time. And we paleoclimatologists like to say that our ability to unlock the secrets of our past is also the key to our future. So here at the department, and in particular in the Pire Create project, we study paleoclimatology and how the climate of the past has changed and its attribution through cave sediments, through tree ring records, historical records, and also through climate model simulations of the past. And Rebecca later is going to talk to you about the cave sediments and how can we infer and estimate past climatic variations with that. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the tree ring science, or what's called dendrochronology. So when it comes to dendrochronology, and in general with the paleoclimatology studies, we need a research question. And this research question, in our case in dendrochronology or dendroclimatology, will have to do with placing the current warming within a long-term context. And we can ask questions to these trees on, is the frequency of extreme hydroclimatic extremes changing? Are there more droughts now, more floods, more extreme events happening now? Are such changes due to anthropogenic activities? Can we attribute those changes to the anthropogenic activities? And then we need to think about where do we want to learn more about this? So we probably can reconstruct the climate of the past for a local area or even a regional area, and we can extend the climate understanding of that particular area beyond the instrumental period that, as I mentioned before, it would be around the 1950s. So once we have the research question, and one research question that we have in our project is about the South American summer monsoon, which is, and Rebecca will talk about it later on, which is very important for many South American countries because it's responsible for a great amount of precipitation for these countries. So we want to address this question. We have to go and do field work in some of these American countries. In this case, last year, and we are making a lot of efforts to collect samples in Bolivia and Peru, because these are countries that hold very old trees and they haven't been exploited yet. And they also have a very strong South American summer monsoon. So if we go to these remote areas and we collect samples of the trees and the very old trees there, and these trees, we find that they are limited, their growth by the precipitation, we will be able to reconstruct the South American summer monsoon beyond the instrumental record, and therefore we will be able to put that South American monsoon into a longer context and learn is that if it's changing or if it's stable. So how do we do the fieldwork in dendrochronology? Last year, when we had the chance to do some hands-on activity with the earth science teachers here at the campus, we use an increment borer, which is not very expensive. With that increment borers, we take some samples of 5 millimeters in diameter. We don't harm the tree. We just take these samples, 2 from each of the trees. And normally we take around 20 to 40 samples within that patch or within that cluster of trees or within that forest to have a representative number of trees that will tell us the story about that forest. Okay, so we have here a tree ring sample after it has been sanded. And so we have here the last year. So the year that we go to the field and take that sample, that will be our last year in the bark. And then we have the pith. And if we count each of the ring width, we will get the age of that particular tree. And not only the age, but each of the rings corresponds to 1 year or 1 season. And the width of that particular width can be then related with the different climate parameters. The next step after we have sanded the samples would be to do the cross-dating process, which is key in dendrochronology, because this means that we have to assign a year to all the samples, and that year has to be the same. We know that because we now use image processing softwares, but we can do that with the different patterns that arise in these samples. So for example, for the year 2000, we have to be sure that we find this pattern in all the samples, so all the cross-dating process is correctly done. This is key and this is really important. And after we have done the cross-dating, then we can start measuring the width of the early good, which is the lighter good, and the late good. And both the early good plus the late good, those form the full ring width. And once we have these measurements, we will get the raw individual series that can look like this. This is an example of a random row series, and they will show most likely a curve like this, because this means millimeters of growth. This means that when the tree is young, they will grow more. This is not because of the climate. This is simply because when they are young, they grow more. So we need to do some statistical techniques that we call the trending process to get rid of this age trend. And once we have only the climatic signal embedded in this tree ring series, we create a chronology, which is the mean of this row series of the samples that we have collected from that particular forest. We put those together. So once we have the chronology, we can then make the attribution of the limiting factors, and we relate the chronology with the climate of that particular region, and we will learn about the climatic factors that affects that particular forest. And once we have that, for example, I show you here an example of the calibration process that we do. And so, for example, here the blue line represents the annual precipitation of a weather instrumental station of a particular area. And in red, we have the reconstructed tree-ring series. And what you can see is that it goes really well. In this particular case, those trees are limited by the annual precipitation. So this means that we can pretty well reconstruct the precipitation of that particular region beyond the instrumental series that ends in 1952. But since we have a chronology of the tree-ring series extending much more than the 1950s, we can extend our reconstruction and learn more about the annual precipitation of that particular region. And for this, within the Pire project, they have been working, our South American colleagues, in what's called now the South American Drought Atlas. And they have done this process for many sites across South America, and with very old forests. And they have developed a South American Drought Atlas for the last 600 years. And one of the things that we can learn with this is that we can, this is the percentage of the dry and wet areas within this South American domain, and we can then assess the amount of extreme or severe wet or dry events that occur within these 600 years. And another thing that we can learn is whether these droughts of the pluvials are, and the return time are increasing towards the present or are decreasing. And in this case, as you see here, the droughts in this particular area are increasing since the 1920s. And the same is true for the pluvials, although to a lesser degree. So we can say that the extreme events, both droughts and the pluvials, are both increasing. And we can also learn with such a great drought atlas, we can go back and relate some specific climatic events with historical events. Like, for example, in the 1800s, what was called the silver mine drought of Potosí, which had many societal consequences. And we have now this drought atlas that allows us to go back to these specific events and study and relate climate and history and the consequence that might have. So this is just another example of what we can do. And I wanted to mention also that maybe you don't have a lab, maybe you don't have an increment borer, but you can always do some exercise that are very representative of what we do in dendrochronology. If you go to the Tree Ring Expeditions website, which is run by Dr. Nicole Davy, and you have there 5 labs that you can go step by step, like if you were going to do a field work, then going to the lab, you have many nice exercises that will make your student feel like they are real scientists, and they can do climate reconstructions and learn more about our past climate. And finally, I wanted to mention that we do have 3 rings, but we also have many other proxy records that allows us to reconstruct the climate of the past. And here I just showed you a map of different proxy records, speleothems, marine sediments, lake sediments, boreholes in the Arctic and the Antarctic. These proxy records, they all have different resolutions. With the 3 ring, we have good resolution of seasonal or annual resolution, but there are other proxies that will give us longer timescales, interdecadal or multi-decadal timescales, but they are all very important to understand the past climate variability and to place this current warming into a longer context. As you can see here, some. And now I will let you with Rebecca Orrison, who will talk about the Speleothem records and what we can learn from there in South America.
So as Ernesto was just showing us a great map of the paleoclimate records that you can find from a variety of different proxies. I'm going to start off by showing you, this is a map of cave records, so proxies that we can take from caves from around the world. And the red and the orange colors here are showing the regions where this particular type of cave is possible to be found. So these are regions that have limestone here or karst in their bedrock. And so that allows for a specific type of infiltration and rock dissolution for these specific type of records to form. So I'll get into that a little bit later. And so within the context of our work in Pire, we're focused mostly on the South American monsoon, as Ernesto mentioned. So we're looking at caves and cave records that come from within South America. And also, as Natalia mentioned, last year some of us had the good fortune of going to Brazil to participate in an annual meeting and an expedition going through the Atlantic rainforest, and the opportunity to go into some of these caves where these records have been found. Here's a photo. This is a group of us that were there. So we had 2 undergraduates, one from SUNY-Albany and one from SUNY-New Paltz, I believe, in our group. So what do these cave deposits look like? So within a cave, there's a variety of different mineral deposits that can be found. Here on the left, this is something called popcorn that's formed on cave walls in a really humid environment. There are also gigantic columns in caves that go from the floor to the ceiling and can form these draperies. On the bottom, this is something called a bacon drapery, being lit from behind by a flashlight. And there are also a variety of different flow stones. Here's a gigantic column you can see, and there's, as water is flowing into the cave, it flows down the side of this column to form these kind of flowing patterns. You also have stalactites that hang from the ceiling and stalagmites that grow from the bottom up in layers. In speleology or speleothem science, the most common record that is used are stalagmites. So these are grown here on this giant pile of dirt in this cave. You can see they grow from the base up, and so the base is going to be the oldest part of the record, and at the top will be the youngest part of the record. Usually the records that we are collecting to study are have broken or fallen over in some way. We try to preserve kind of the cave ecology so that we aren't having to destroy speleothems that are currently growing. Unless, of course, if we're studying the modern period, then it would be necessary to kind of collect one of these in its middle of its growth process. So once a speleothem has been collected from the field, they have to be brought back to the lab and cut open and sanded and polished. And this is what they look like. So these are layered deposits, as I mentioned. But unlike trees, these layers don't represent annual growth. So you can't tell just from looking at a speleothem how old it might be. And so this is, you can kind of see here, there are some markings dug out, and these are used to sample the radioisotopes within the Speleothem. So I can, these are some pictures from our summer school. Here on the left is one of our colleagues, Nico. He's sanding down a Speleothem that's been cut in half. And on the right, he's sampling out in a clean workbench some material that can be sent off to a different lab to do the sampling of the radioisotopes for the age dating. Then in another part of the lab, the Speleothem itself is sampled here at pretty regular intervals, around 2 millimeters, so very close together. And a very small amount of the material is taken out and put into a vial, as you can see here. And that's put into an isotope ratio mass spectrometer, which is this big machine on the right. And so usually the material within the vials is combusted or dissolved in some acid solution. And then the isotope masses of the material can be measured by this machine. And so before I get into what we can interpret from the isotope values within the samples, I want to zoom out a little bit and look at how these speleothems form within the cave environment. So this is kind of a busy diagram, but here we can start from the top with the rainfall coming in. So as the rain comes in from whatever source, it falls first through the soil layer. And in the soil layer, the water picks up a lot of carbon and forms carbonic acid. And it infiltrates through the soil and down into the bedrock. And as it goes through the cracks and crevices and fractures of that karst layer, the kind of rock, limestone bedrock, the carbonic acid dissolves the calcium carbonate within that bedrock and forms bicarbonate and calcium solution. So this infiltrates further down into the bedrock until it can form droplets within a cave. Then within the cave, the droplets that have fallen have a really high concentration of carbon, a much higher concentration of carbon than is in the cave environment. And so that pressure differential between of CO2 between the cave environment and this droplet leads to an off-gassing, whereby the CO2 escapes from the droplet and goes into the cave, which is often why caves have a higher CO2 concentration than the ambient atmosphere, although still not as high as that soil layer, which is what leads to that off-gassing process. So then here, the next step of the process, you can see these drips that are formed at the base of these stalactites, and either the drip would form here on a stalactite, or it might fall and fall on top of a growing stalagmite. And then after that off-gassing happens, the calcium carbonate within the droplet would crystallize and form into that layer. It's a little hard to see, but within this droplet, you can kind of see on the outside, there's some of that crystallization process is happening. So we can follow the water on its journey as it infiltrates, as it kind of comes in from some source and infiltrates into the soil and the cave environment. But the scientific interest we have here is in following the isotopes on their journey as they travel and are impacted by different thermodynamic processes or kind of equilibrial processes on their journey into the Speleothem. So the kind of chemistry of the system as I mentioned, the samples can't be dated layer by layer. Instead, we use the uranium-thorium ratios within the speleothems from sampled points along the axis of the speleothem in order to measure how old the sample might be. So once a layer is formed, the uranium that came from the soil above becomes trapped and stops accumulating. And once the uranium stops accumulating, it begins to decay. And it decays into a daughter product, which is the thorium-230. And so we can measure the ratio between the uranium and the thorium to have a sense of how long that particular layer was buried. And that gives you a date from the present to the past. For that point, it gives you a date for that point on the speleothem. The hydroclimate data is measured from the calcium carbonate within the speleothem, which is kind of the base of the building block of the speleothem itself. So we're measuring carbon and oxygen primarily. There are also trace elements that can be measured, iron, etc. But I'm going to focus mostly on oxygen, which is the main proxy that I use and that we're using to look at the hydrologic cycles variability. So this is just a quick review of the oxygen isotopes. We have a heavier oxygen 18 and a lighter isotope oxygen 16. And so chemically these are equivalent, but the heavy isotope is 12.5% heavier than the light isotope, which can lead to some of these fractionation processes whereby, which I'll get into a little bit later. And so they're impacted by environmental conditions differently. The light isotope is significantly more abundant than the heavier isotope. Only about 0.2% of oxygen is that heavy oxygen 18. It's also oxygen 17, which is even less abundant, but is less commonly used in this work. The way that we evaluate our isotopes is by using something called the delta notation. The delta notation is essentially expresses the ratio between the heavy or the least common and the light or the most common isotopes in some sample relative to a standard reference value. And because the quantity of oxygen 18 is so small, we scale this by 1,000 to have more kind of human numbers. So a negative delta 18O value would indicate that there are fewer heavy isotopes than in the standard reference, whereas a positive delta value would indicate more heavy isotopes than in the standard reference. So a way to visualize this kind of in a map form, these are the annually averaged values of the delta 18O that we would find in precipitation and rainfall across this domain. This is data that comes from a climate model, so it's not actually measurements. And kind of to orient you, when we're looking at this, we would see winds blowing from the east here over the continent and then down south. And so there's a few different impacts that we can draw from this map. One is the source effect. This isn't exactly accurate because it's not the delta value of the ocean, but you can see that the rainfall does have an impact on the, depending on, the rainfall would have an impact on the delta values of the ocean itself. And so it's important to consider the source of the moisture and that different sources of moisture, whether it's from sort of the center of the tropical Atlantic or closer to the continent, would have a different delta value. Another important isotope effect is a continental effect. After water has evaporated from the ocean, the lighter values evaporate more preferentially than the heavier values. And as we move further inland, the rain that falls first is heavier values. So those are going to be less negative. And as we move over the continent, there's less and less of that heavy oxygen 18 remaining because it rained out earlier. And so we're getting progressively more and more negative values as we move across the continent. Another important effect is the altitude effect. You can sort of see this bullseye here over the Andes. where there are the most negative values are found at the top of the mountains, and the least negative values are found more at the base of the mountains. This effect comes as clouds are moving up the mountains. The water that's condensing in the clouds and rains out is raining out the heavier oxygen 18 that would be left first. And as we get to the top of the mountain, the clouds have progressively less and less oxygen 18. And so the rain that's falling is more and more depleted of that oxygen 18. Another important effect is the Rayleigh distillation effect. This is kind of a temperature effect. As the moisture is moving from the lower latitudes to higher latitudes, you can see that there are kind of cooler temperatures as we're going to higher latitudes, and this is leading to more and more negative values of delta 18O as a result, again, of this condensational effect and of clouds condensing with cooler temperatures and raining out as they move from the lower latitudes to higher latitudes. So it's really a lot of information that we can gather about the region from oxygen 18 and from oxygen isotopes. So, you know, we might be measuring our isotopes at a particular location in the continent at a cave, but there are a variety of effects that need to be considered. The isotope patterns that you might measure at a particular cave location tell kind of this adventure story of the isotopes and the story of the water cycle. So the isotopes at a particular location, unlike trees, which are giving you kind of specific local information, the isotopes are giving you a more regional picture. So you can kind of see the value of different types of proxies for different types of questions. So the types of questions that we can answer with oxygen isotopes is something about where the water at a particular location might have come from. This is something related to the source effect. We can ask questions about where the water traveled in its journey, either by understanding the Rayleigh distillation effect across latitudes, the continental effect, or the effect of mountains. We can ask what has happened along the way. If the isotope patterns at a particular location are changing, were the wind patterns changing, what kind of precipitation recycling was happening, were there changes in vegetation over time. So as Ernesto mentioned, the things that we can learn about the climate of the past can be really important in the context of future warming. And there's a lot we can really learn about the climate system from the paleoclimate evidence that we have gathered within this Pire project, but also within the paleoclimate community in general. So we can contextualize the current warming in paleoclimate. Kind of this is an alternate version of what Ernesto said earlier, that the present is the key to the past and the past is the key to the future. And so there are principles and different approaches we use to really apply this in practice. So just to summarize briefly, the principle of uniformitarianism is important, which states that the modern relationships we observe in the climate have operated unchanged throughout periods of interest in the past. We also can think about paleoclimate as being a constraint on internal variability, that paleoclimate evidence, as we're learning about the climate of the past, enhances our understanding about how the climate system may have varied in space and time, and better understand the long-term trends of our climate system. We use paleoclimate evidence to understand how the system might respond to external forcings. We have paleoclimate evidence in periods of time that are recording really historic events that we haven't captured in our current observations. So these could be periods of really high atmospheric CO2 levels, really strong volcanic eruptions, extensive volcanic eruptions, periods of time with different solar input than we experience at present, and other types of external forcings. And finally, we can use paleoclimate evidence to have to understand something about past analogs for current warming. There are definitely periods in time that are as warm as today, though these go quite far back in time, not kind of covered within the context of Pire. But we can use some of these climate analogs to help us understand the future warming we might anticipate.
Thank you, Ernesto and Rebecca. You did a great job. I hope you enjoyed this short session about our project, Pire Create project. And as I mentioned at the beginning, you can find more information in our website and social media channels. See you soon.